Welcome back to another episode of the Shanti Ma podcast. If you're enjoying the podcast, make sure to like and subscribe. You can also support the podcast by becoming a member on Patreon at www.patreon.com/Shantima. With your support, I'm able to upgrade things such as the sound and video quality so that you can have the best experience possible. Today's guest brings a deep love of rhythm, drums, and dance to his distinctive style of organic, tribal, folktronica, and bass fusion. As expert percussionist specializing in tambourines and frame drums, he weaves together intricate hand percussion and electronic sounds into finely sculpted grooves. Originating in San Francisco's crucible of belly dance, bass culture, and world music fusion, Drumspyder has come into his own as an original producer, building a substantial catalog of work on the Caravan, Dakini, and Desert Trax labels, then striking out on his own with 3 original EPs released independently since 2015. I almost said 1915. With his latest album, 9 Branches, released just last month. He's a prolific remixer, lending his signature live percussion and melodic touch to the Desert Dwellers, Deya Dova, Porangui, and various other artists and traditional ensembles. He's a super interesting guy with lots of cool things to say, and I absolutely enjoyed our time together. You guys are absolutely going to love him. So without further ado, please welcome to the show, Scott Sterling, aka Drumspyder. Thank you so much for coming on the show and taking the time to sit with me today. I actually remember seeing you at Symbiosis. I think that was in 2015, I believe. And I remember you came down to the crowd afterwards when Deya Dova was on the stage, and I briefly talked to you for a moment. And I remembered really enjoying your set because your hands are literally like a Drumspyder. It's like a turbocharged Drumspyder. And it was just such different, groovy kind of music that was so fun to dance to that, made me feel really good. And I'd never really heard anything like that before. And then I remember catching you again in Kitsilano on New Year's Eve. I think it was 2017 or something like that. And I just wanted to say I really appreciate the unique energy and just the overall, the unique energy that you contribute to the music scene. It's so different. And I think that variety is the spice of life. And I'm a big fan of your work. So thank you very much for joining me today.
Well, thank you. Yeah, it's good to be on here. And those are some memorable gigs. I definitely remember Symbiosis 2015.
Mm-hmm.
And that was sort of wrapped up a pretty big summer of playing festivals. I played Sonic Bloom that year and a lot of other things. So I appreciate it. When people, I appreciate it when people appreciate the live drumming aspect. That's really the center of the music for me. I've been playing drums much longer than I've been producing music, although I've been producing for a while. But drumming is really the essence of it for me, and so I wouldn't play live if I wasn't playing drums. So that's really what it's all based around. And the electronic drum that I play, it's most people see me playing that, but I am also I love the acoustic drums, and that's what I play at home. And my main drumming types are frame drums and tambourines. And so the electronic drum that you see me playing in a Drumspyder festival gig is sort of like the portable electronic version of what I like to play, but it works pretty well.
I was wondering, is that, I've never seen anything like that before. Is that like a custom made drum, or like, is that a more common electronic drum? Or, I mean, I don't know anything about drums,
it is
but
widely available. Yeah, it's the Korg Wave Drum Global.
Mhm.
And so it's made to be a simulation of an acoustic instrument. It has a bit of an acoustic component to it, where there's actually a drum head on there, and it has this tension on it and picks up this little acoustic bit of the signal, but then it combines that internally with electronic sound. So what comes out is sort of a combination of your acoustically hitting the drum head and then electronic rendition of some percussion instruments. And really, like, it has a huge variety of sounds, and I am pretty specialized though in my drumming. It's like I'm devoted to frame drums and tambourines, so those are the sounds that you hear.
Okay.
Coming out
Yeah.
of the wave drum.
It's very it's kind of, I want to say tribal, but it isn't, because I know that with doing some reading online about where you pull your influence from, I would say it's more Middle Eastern and in those kinds of sounds, correct? Like that kind of, it's Middle Eastern or more European, and in less, I would say less tribal. But for me, I hear it and I hear drums like that and I think tribal, but it's more Middle Eastern, correct?
Well, I've been on a journey of evolving my music, and I've taken on different musical focuses, and so things have changed a little bit. I mean, I think as far as the drumming and percussion goes, my journey with hand percussion, I used to play drum set with sticks, but my journey with hand percussion really started with learning Arabic percussion styles and instruments. I started off with some great teachers who were kind of from the Syria, Lebanon region, and so I played Arabic tabla or doumbek for quite a while.
Oh, nice.
Gradually after that, I switched to frame drums, and a lot of my technique is rooted in some Mediterranean and Middle Eastern styles. Definitely still use like a lot of the finger technique that comes from that region. Although recently it's been more of an evolution into this sort of kind of overall fusion frame drum style that's been pioneered by Glenn Velez, a master of the frame drum, and then David Kukerman, who's also kind of pushed forward a lot of like kind of contemporary frame drum technique. And so a lot of what we do on the frame drums is sort of a combination of really techniques from all over the world, and it like synthesizes a lot of styles. Like frame drums are very versatile instruments, and so you can use a lot of different kinds of techniques on them, get such a variety of different sounds. And so right now I would describe my drumming as kind of like contemporary frame drum or fusion frame drumming. As far as the melodies and the other qualities of the music, yes, I started out with, or at least as in the solo Drumspyder guys, I started out with doing Arabic fusion music, belly dance music. I work with belly dancers a great deal. In the past 3 or 4 years, I've turned to Celtic traditions, and so now my music is a combination of traditional music of the British Islands, folk music, and medieval European music, and so my latest album, Nine Branches, is all songs from the British Isles and European medieval music.
Yeah, I was listening to some of that actually last night. Actually, I listen to your music quite a lot when I'm at the gym because it's really peppy. But I was listening to your latest album that you released on Bandcamp, and I was wondering what made you shift more into the Celtic style, because you were saying that you were playing maybe more Mediterranean, and now it's kind of shifted into more Celtic. What was the shift? Like, how did that shift? How did you shift into that?
Well, it's been a journey of about the past 4 years, and there are various reasons for it. I mean, you could go into all kinds of issues about ancestry and authenticity and so on and so forth, and wanting to connect with my own ancestry and my own tradition.
Mm-hmm.
I could talk also about pagan traditions and European paganism, which I'm also devoted to. But I think mainly I just realized around 2015 that like this is what I was listening to. This is what I love to listen to. I got got into Scottish folk music and English folk, and I started listening to some of the like kind of rock fusion bands. Like Fairport Convention is a favorite, like big inspiration for me. And so I just kind of realized that that's what was in my earphones all the time around the summer of 2015, and I just just decided like I want to connect with this music, and I want to start playing things like this. And since then I have also in addition to learning sort of different styles of music and connecting with these traditions, I've also been learning new instruments. Like I'm playing the whistles, and so the lead kind of flute melodies on my recent albums, I've all played those myself and learned like
I was
learning traditional
wondering.
tunes on the whistles.
Yeah, I was wondering about that. That sounds great.
Yeah, and it's been a big move. Like I used to be very sample based because the only acoustic instruments I really had in my hands was the drums, and then the rest would be virtual instruments and samples, and I did a lot of remixing too. I had a great time with an Arabic belly dance music label in Southern California, where I would remix works that, like recordings that they had uh, on their catalog of traditional Arabic ensembles. So I did a lot of that. Did tons of remixing. Um, but lately, yeah, I've been moving towards playing my own instruments and doing things with my own sounds. So that's also been a part of the evolution of my music.
Yeah, well, I remember the first time I ever heard one of your songs. It was a remix that you did, one of Desert Dwellers. I know you've done a few, and it was so peppy and so fun, and that was kind of how I was first introduced to your music. And I kind of actually was wondering about that. Like, when now you've obviously shifted. There's two questions I have with what you're saying. The first one is, now that obviously you've shifted into more, like you were saying, Celtic, pagan, Scottish sort of vibes. But prior to that, how did you pick, just curious, how did you pick the songs to remix for like Desert Dwellers and Deya Dova and David Starfire? Like, how did you pick which ones you were going to remix?
Well, to me, sort of like the pillars of music, or what I focus in on, and um, what I hone in on are the melody and the rhythm. And obviously, the rhythm, I have certain ideas about the rhythmic character I want to give to a tune. But then, besides that, I'm mainly responding to the melody, and I just pick it based on whether the melody resonates with me. I have a pretty strong preference for vocal tracks, and obviously Deya Dova is a great singer, and I've
Mm-hmm.
remixed her solo works. I've also remixed tracks that she's singing on, like one of my Liquid Bloom remixes.
Mm.
And
Love
so,
Liquid
yeah, I mean,
Bloom.
I just kind of like hone in, like, well, just does a song really speak to me? And I like to bring out the melody as much as possible. And often my remixes, you might have noticed, but they tend to be a little more, often a little shorter than the original track, and a little more like I just like to hone in on those melodic parts and the lead
Mm-hmm.
vocals and really emphasize its quality as a song.
Hmm. Well, I would say that your remixes are some of my favorite remixes, especially with some of the Desert Dwellers and Deya Dova. Um, you were saying Liquid Bloom. I actually recently kind of discovered Liquid Bloom. Incidentally, it was through a YouTube channel. I don't know if you've ever heard of Shiva Light, but they have like this really psychedelic sort of um, digital art, and then they put these remixes or sets on there, and I was like, this sounds really good, and I'm hearing all these different beats, and I'm like, then I didn't realize that Liquid Bloom is a project that is also created by one of the guys from Desert Dwellers. Is that correct?
Yes, I think there it mainly Amani of the Desert Dwellers. I'm not like in the Liquid Bloom studio, so forgive me if I'm sort of wrong about like if I'm leaving out people who are involved. But my contact with the Desert Dwellers has always been Amani mainly,
Okay.
and so he's the one who gets in touch with me about remixing Liquid Bloom tracks.
Right.
I think they also have a larger kind of roster of musicians or contributors that
Mhm.
do a lot of great instrumental parts and vocals for their songs. But it's remixing tends to be a little bit long distance. So sometimes, like when I get a Desert Dwellers remix, sometimes I'm not even quite aware of who is singing or who's playing the sitar or whatever. So it's a little more distant than people might think. It's like I just sort of get this package of sounds
Oh, see,
and
I had no
work
idea
with
how
them.
that worked. And it's funny because it was a few years back. I think I I didn't even know that this kind of music existed. It was like, we kind of grow up on and like we grow up on this like cringeworthy top 40 kind of music. And then I started going to music festivals. I went to my first festival ever. I didn't even know that they existed when I was in India back in 2012. And it was this really crazy, like, had to walk through the forest and then cross the river. And then it was this, like, um, big Israeli psytrance party. And that was for me so eye opening. I was like, wow, these things exist. And then after that, I, was going to Motion Notion and Shambhala, Base Coast, and I'd have to say Symbiosis was my absolute favorite. I went to that one, I think, 2 or 3 years in a row. Um, and I started discovering, artists like you and Desert Dwellers, Deya Dova, Govinda, um, and I I feel like it is in some way, it's not an underground style of music, but I I feel like it kind of is in a way, it's not a mainstream kind of music, but the way that it makes you feel when you listen to it is why I feel so drawn to artists like yourself. And so, yeah, basically, I'm just pumping your tires right now and saying thank you so much for creating music like this, because it's just so fun to dance to. It's so fun to listen to. I enjoy driving in my car and listening to it. And at the gym, like, it's basically good anywhere. You could play it in a yoga class.
Yeah, well, thank you. I've received a lot of good responses and feedback from people from all of those different settings. It could be a forest festival, could be a yoga class. I recently played an ecstatic dance in Salt Lake City. Really, really nice event, really nice community there. And so, yeah, I think that in some way, I mean, like I think the kind of central idea I have, or the vision in my head when I'm creating my music, is sort of is some kind of pagans dancing around the bonfire kind of scene,
Yes.
and then from there it could branch out. It could be maybe a yoga studio, or it could be a festival. But I definitely I like the festival setting, and I kind of like how um, people get into dancing, sort of dancing on the earth, and just so that it's to me it's just a more sort of grounded connection with people and connection with the dancer than the medium where you're mainly emphasizing either putting out recordings, which I do, of course, but or playing in urban clubs, which are just a little more of a different vibe. And it's not like people just don't have their feet on the ground quite as much in urban clubs. I see.
Yeah, I find clubs and stuff to be a bit of a cold vibe. I actually don't even go out I don't go out to clubs unless there's a really good show. And actually, that's why I had been, racking my brain and thinking, okay, there has to be some way that I can bring more of this kind of music to Vancouver, because I really feel like other than Beats Without Borders, we don't really have a lot of this kind of music coming into town. And it's interesting because I find Vancouver has a bit of a cold vibe anyways. And the nightlife is just not even worthwhile for me to go out. So when, I was thinking about that and I'm like, okay, basically for me, unless it's a music festival, and so that's only like, maybe once or twice a year that I go to dance, I otherwise don't, because I don't enjoy the nightclub kind of scene, because there is a different quality of how you feel in a place, and I find that at a music festival, like you were saying, tribal dancing on the earth, I feel so free when I'm dancing at a music festival, and there is such a community, collective kind of energy of everybody kind of looking out for each other. It's something that you really have to experience. That I hope, if people are listening to this, you go to a music festival, you have to experience that for yourself. But yeah, to do some mini festivals or something like that would be fantastic. Like if we could do something like that, get more out this way, because it seems to me that the San Francisco Bay Area and Nevada, you guys seem to have some amazing festivals with tons of, art installations, and they're just so next level. And we don't really have anything like that here. So there's some things that I've got working away. It might just take a little bit of time, but I've got some ideas about wanting to, down the road, do a little bit more for the community here when it comes to setting some art festivals and music. But so you were saying that you are really drawn to paganism. Is like, well, you said you're devoted to it. Am I allowed to ask you a little bit about that? Because I don't really know much about paganism, but I'm so curious to hear a little bit about that.
Oh, sure. Yeah, there are many pagan traditions and many great traditions from Europe. And my particular branch is in Northern European, Germanic. It goes by the name of heathenry. People call us heathens, or some people prefer the term ancestral. It's a little more of a correct designation of it. And so, yeah, it's a lot like, if you think of, the Greco-Roman gods, there's it's a polytheistic religion. There's many gods. There's sort of gods for different aspects of reality and the universe. And so Asatru is a Northern European based version of that. You've probably heard of some of the northern gods like Thor and Odin. They're not really exactly like the comic book versions of them, but when you go deeper into it, it's a great tradition, and it's at the roots of a lot of European culture. And so that's also something that I started connecting with more specifically about maybe like 7 years or so ago, and I started being interested in paganism, and I started off reading like Christopher Penzak's Temple of Witchcraft series and other kind of basic pagan stuff. Then I started just honed in and got more specific, and started learning more about the northern traditions. So It's yeah, I don't know if I can give a summary of, a grand, spiel about what it's about, but it's been a journey for me. It's really a constant. I'm always learning more about it and learning more about the history, and in conjunction with that, the traditional artistic styles
Yeah, I
within
noticed
the
you have
British Islands also.
yeah, I was going to say you do a lot of pagan art also.
Yeah, yeah, I do my own album covers, and I've done painting and artwork in various forms for most of my life, but in the past few years, I've really dug into the Celtic design styles, and been learning how to do like the knotwork, the maze patterns, spiral patterns, the different kind of motifs that figure into old Northern European art. And then I've started applying that to my album cover design, and I'm doing drawings and paintings. And it's artwork is a little more of a side project at this point, but I'm starting to scale it up. I'm doing paintings with acrylic on canvas now, and so
Right on.
taking on some larger themes.
Yeah, it's I should connect you with my partner. Um he's very much into I don't know if you would have seen any of his stuff online or whatever. He goes by Hellrune on on Instagram.
Yes, yes.
Yeah,
I
that's
think I think we're connected on Instagram. That the name's definitely familiar.
okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I know he's always looking for different projects and collaborations and things like that. And he's also a musician. And if you are really, I know it's completely different from the electronic style of what you're creating, but they've got this new project called Boreal Hymn.
Hmm.
And I'll have to send you a link to that because it's very when they played it, I was thinking, I feel like Vikings, like trudging through the mountains or something like that to this music. It's got this very primal Viking kind of sound and very. Do you know Wardruna or any of those sort of?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
Well, that
it's
sounds great to me. I'll
yeah,
definitely check it out. Yeah, Wardruna
yeah.
is a great inspiration to me. I listen to a lot of the um, sort of pagan and heathen bands like Faun and Corvus Corax as well. Most of my
Okay.
listening tends to be to the traditional music, like the old folk and medieval, but
Mhm.
but I love those bands too. And I saw Wardruna a few months ago in San Francisco, and
Oh, no
really, really
way.
good show.
No
Yeah.
way. Yeah, they've got a very Bordruna vibe. So I'll send you a link and you can check them out. And you can, I was thinking I should tell Bronson to get in touch with you and see about some of your art because I was looking at your art and I was thinking, because I don't know a lot about paganism. Or anything heathen whatsoever. I'm very like Buddhism, Hinduism, and like that's where my knowledge tends to go. But I keep seeing all of this stuff, and when I was looking at your art, I guess this was a couple months back, and I was like, then I'm looking at all of Hellrune Bronson stuff, and I was like, is this is? I feel like there's a connection here. It's
Yeah.
very similar. Um, so you were saying you have roots there, but you grew up in San Francisco. You didn't grow up in Europe, or
No, I grew up in Massachusetts.
oh, okay.
I came to the West Coast um, for school. And so I've been living on the West Coast ever since. I've lived in Portland and San Diego, as well as here in the Bay Area. But most of my artistic and music life is been in San Francisco for quite a few years. Um, but just to backtrack a tiny bit, if
Mhm.
I could get a little plug in,
Oh, of course, please.
I'm quite interested in remixing music of the sort of heathen, pagan, Viking genre. So I'm quite interested in what you were saying about this music that you're talking about. And so
Oh,
definitely,
yes.
if anyone's out there wants to have their traditional Viking music or Celtic folk or whatever remixed, don't hesitate to get in touch with me because I'm definitely interested.
Well, I'm going to talk to the boys. It's Colby Hink and Bronson Lee Norton. They're the ones who created this project, but
Uh-huh.
I know that you like to work with female vocals, and there's some really incredible vocals on their track Banner of Grief, which I'm tooting my own horn a little bit because I did sing on that track.
All right, nice.
So that would be like a dream. I will definitely send you their stuff, and I don't see why the boys, I mean, obviously I'm speaking for them, but I don't see why the boys wouldn't be interested in some remixing, as long as it was I don't know how the record label stuff works. I know that they just got a deal with Artifact or whatever, so I don't know anything about record labels and
Uh-huh.
rules and all of that, but oh, that would be so amazing. So thank you for putting that out there. Please feel free to plug away. Do you have any shows while we're at it? Do you have any shows coming up soon?
I'm going to be at home for a while, so I just did a bunch of shows around the winter solstice. So not for a bit, but I do have some good stuff coming up in Oregon in March.
Okay.
I'm going up to a place called Lost Valley, and I think we're getting a show together in Bend and definitely in Portland for In Spirit. So yeah, there's definitely things brewing for March and April. I'm going to be at Zen Awakening in Florida and Earthbeat in New Zealand also. So it's going to be
Ooh.
a busy March and April coming up.
Wow. Have you been to New Zealand before?
Yes, I was played at Earthbeat last year.
Okay.
So going to be my second time there.
So have you traveled quite a bit then? Obviously, it's so funny. I sent you all these footnotes, and now I'm into all these other questions, but I find this so fascinating. Yeah, have you traveled a fair bit all over the world, like for your music?
Yeah. Yeah, most of my gigs have been in North America and tends to be a little more focused on the West Coast than the East Coast, but still I have had the opportunity to get all over the continent pretty much.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's been really nice. Mainly in the past 5 years or so, it's when I started doing festivals. And so yeah, I had the opportunity to play in a lot of beautiful places. I love the forests and
Mm-hmm.
those kind of outdoor gatherings. So yeah, it's been nice to be able to get it and travel.
How long have you been how long have you been making electronic music? I know you've said you've been, you know, your music journey has obviously been quite long, but how long have you been into the electronic?
Well, for doing solo Drumspyder and dance music of this type, it's been a little more than 10 years. The beginnings of it were sort of gradual, so I don't quite know when to date the beginning of when I started doing this kind of thing. Um, but definitely for the last 10 years, I've been doing tracks under the Drumspyder name. Before that, I was involved in dance troupes and bands of other types. And I started off as just a percussionist, just a drummer, and then I gradually sort of got into more elements of the music and started incorporating electronic sounds and other things. And so it was sort of this gradual ramp up into doing my own tracks. And it's actually quite a while before I did a complete finished track. And that's one thing that I tell to aspiring producers a lot is just like, don't worry about that slow learning curve, because it definitely took me a while. Like I was kind of I was playing drums and fiddling with electronic sounds like for a pretty long time before I really, got the finished tracks out and started doing what I'm doing now.
Yeah, because the thing is that that's something I've been trying to remind myself as well as I think it's easy for people to look at the final sort of the big picture and be like, wow, that's so unachievable, and I could never do that, or oh, that would take so much time and work. But instead of looking at where someone is at 10 years down the road, like before, you got to where you were, there was all those little tiny baby steps. So I try to remind myself of that as well, that it's all the little tiny steps that you take every single day that accumulate over a long time to get you on a plane to be headed to a festival and playing in New Zealand.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I am really into seeing artwork and music as a craft and approaching it like a craft. Like, don't think about like having the sudden blast of inspiration, painting a masterpiece or doing this genius track right now. It's you can't do this in one day. It's all this sort of gradual, crafts and learning the techniques. And I'm definitely in that process right now. I'm always learning new songs and learning techniques on new instruments, and still learning things that are, pretty new to me. And so I definitely am, like, another thing, if there's any like aspiring producers listening, I definitely tell them, like, yeah, concentrate on the craft and concentrate on practicing and working on things every day, and you'll get there.
Yeah.
I think even nowadays, I think my tastes maybe have evolved over the years, and that I also I like it when I see that sort of craft and patience in works. Like, you look at the old like Celtic manuscript designs and medieval manuscripts and things, you can just see the patience and the work and the craft knowledge that went into that. And that's what I like to hear in music as well. It's like when people have really engaged with their instrument, really hone their technique on the instrument. That's what's inspiring to me.
Yeah, I think it's also really important, for people to remember that we're also living in a time where we, because of technology and even just sort of the hypnosis that we're a bit under with like the way that programs like Instagram work, all this swiping and stuff, and the images changing every 2 seconds, 5 seconds. It's kind of trained our brains to expect things instantaneous. I mean, we order something online from Amazon, we get it the next day. We want, I don't know, there's an instant gratification that we have, and I think it is confusing for a lot of people. And like, I feel really lucky that I'm, just sort of on the brink of like not being in that generation of like having a cell phone. Basically, I didn't have a cell phone until I was like 17 or 18 or something like that. And so I feel like I kind of just escaped that. But for a lot of people now, this instant gratification, wanting everything now, but that's not realistic. And, somebody like you, or, looking at another successful artist or professional of any kind, it is years of dedication and patience and practice. And it's not something that you're just like, I'm going to do this, and then all of a sudden you're successful. There's a lot of that trial and error, but I think it's definitely worthy of mention that we need to be realistic about our what is possible in what amount of time and what goes into it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I definitely feel that there's there's such a difference between being in that sort of instant gratification, electronic sort of Instagram zone of like, if these things are flashing in front of you, and that kind of electronic zone where you want to just kind of like pull up a sound and make the track in 10 minutes and things like that. And then between that state of mind and then the other state where you're sort of patiently drawing something on paper, or you're working away at the technique of an instrument, and you realize that it doesn't come instantly, and you have to like slow it down and play the song really, really slowly. Like every track on my album, I started out by playing that melody on the flute like really, really slowly, like one note at a time, because flute playing is really a new skill for me. And so I have to be patient with it. But then also in drumming, I have a lot more experience on drums, but I still practice I go back to basics a lot. I play basic kind of patterns on the drums and basic exercises, and I still have some of the books of basic rhythmic patterns that I started out with years ago. And sometimes I go back to those and just build things up, start it really slowly, gradually build up speed. It's it's a great thing to have, and I think it's one of the things that unifies spiritual practices with artistic techniques, is that there's a quality of slowing down and doing this sort of patient meditation with it that I really like. It definitely. I've also had some experience with things like Buddhist meditation and yoga. I still practice yoga pretty frequently, and there's definitely a similarity of the process with that. It's one of the things I'm really glad that I have that in my life. This sort of grounding process, like this process of practicing drums and practicing instruments. It's it's kind of like my meditation or one of them. It's something that I'm grateful to have.
Well, it makes you more inspired. Like, that's the thing when you have a spiritual practice of whatever kind. And like, when you say spiritual practice, it doesn't have to be dogmatic in any way. It can be, it means different things for different people, but anything that grounds you and brings you into touch with, the present moment, I feel like you can pull so much creative juice and inspiration from that space. And I know that I always think back to one of the books that I read, years back, and he was saying that inspired, it comes from the root word in spirit. When you're in spirit, you're inspired. So I like what you said about that, because I think that when you slow down, you have the opportunity to really enjoy each step and each moment. And, even to take a moment and be like, wow, like looking back on where you were a year ago and 5 years ago, or when something, some new opportunity comes along, and, just really taking a moment to savor that as well. I think it makes you a way more grateful person, which just improves the quality of not only your life, but your personality.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what kind of yoga do you practice?
I did a Ashtanga for a long time. That's kind of how I learned yoga in a serious way. I was pretty regular with Ashtanga classes.
Okay.
These days, I tend to take it in a little bit like smaller doses than the full primary series, and so I do kind of like the yoga of roughly that type, the kind of vinyasa based flow, but usually it's a little more like 45-minute session or a half an hour or something. And I've gotten maybe a little bit less intense on it. I've taken up other kinds of training, like I'm really into mace, like steel mace workouts. Okay. So I kind of split my daily sort of workout time between steel mace and yoga, and find those balance each other pretty well.
The battle, it's like the battle mace or whatever.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. It's basically this weighted club looking thing that you swing around. Cool. It's an unusual. I think I took it up because I was never into gyms and regular weightlifting.
It gets boring. Something like a mace just seems more like
yeah. Yeah. So I took up the mace. It's like, oh, this is interesting for some reason. So I think it's part of inspiration. I think you just go with what you're drawn to and interests you and seems like cool to do, and it's like, oh, this is cool, swinging this thing around. So
that's perfect. But that's perfect though, because you are balancing both of your energies. You're doing something more active and young, and then you're doing something a little more yin. So you're balancing your energies. It sounds like you've got a good balance of both worlds. Because I have found that for me,
just doing yoga wasn't quite enough. Obviously, I love yoga. I love yoga, but I found that it wasn't quite enough for me. Like, I wanted to also still keep my body strong, because for me, I suffer from like some chronic pain, and so keeping my body really, really strong, but then also keeping it limber and stretching, I find that the two together tend to be a really good balance. But I actually recently started doing kinetic training at the gym, because I'm working with a kinesiologist who's kind of helping me like rehabilitate my body and whatnot. And I was getting so bored with just lifting weights and doing the like just static sort of movements, and to actually do something where I'm doing more explosive movements and working my whole body. So I've never actually used a mace before, but I feel like those more explosive movements where you're using your whole entire body, it's way more interesting, and it doesn't get so boring. Do you put music on when you're doing your mace? I feel like some medieval music or something
Yeah.
would be.
Yeah. Doing yoga and bass is good, like music listening time. And yeah, it's I listen to a variety of stuff. Sometimes like I found that like medieval works well for yoga. That's often my yoga soundtrack. But then for mace, I like to like step it up a bit. Sometimes I'll put on like Scottish marching band music with bagpipes. Sometimes I'll put on some, little Viking metal. Like that's one genre of music that I listen to a bit, like bands like Tyr and Skullmold and Amon Amarth and stuff. And so when you want to get a little more amped up, that's a good mace soundtrack.
Yeah, that's what I was picturing that. So, so kind of to bit switch gears here, because I was kind of wondering about this, because I know, like I said, I feel like the San Francisco Bay Area tends to have a lot of, well, I mean, if we go back and we look at like, Santana and Janis Joplin, like a lot of like pretty iconic people and musicians have come out of that area or made it there. And I know that with my own experience from place to place and traveling, I've always noticed a different energy from place to place. And I was wondering if you thought that maybe there was a connection between the energy of a place like, San Francisco and Nevada for like, I say Nevada, I don't really know. Maybe I'm just thinking Burning Man, but, the San Francisco area more so. There's a lot of, there seems to be a lot of really epic music coming out of there. And I was just wondering if there's like this creative energy that maybe exists there. If you could tell me what you think about that.
Well, yeah, that's an interesting topic. It's complex. I mean, there's a lot of cultural history just to this area of the country, California, the West Coast, all the kind of 60s music, the folk revival. And so, yeah, it's a lot to get into. I mean, I don't know if I have a kind of, I don't have my finger on the pulse exactly of the San Francisco Bay Area culture as a whole right now. The way things have turned out, I actually don't play locally that much in the Bay Area. Most of my gigs are traveling to other parts of the country, and mostly Northwest. So a lot of people think that I live in Portland or Seattle, but I don't. I live in Berkeley. And so, but I can think of a lot of things in the West Coast and the California culture that have really inspired and influenced me. One of the things that influenced me and inspired me a lot as a drummer was Mickey Hart's work, and Mickey Hart, the drummer of the Grateful Dead, one of them, and he came out with a couple books in the 90s about drumming and kind of this sort of tour through the world of drumming and all this world music, and those were big inspirations for me. And of course his music and his solo projects and his drumming with the Dead. And in many ways you could say the Grateful Dead really sort of invented the current festival scene, the whole concept of like the camp out festival with all the culture surrounding it and the arts and crafts and things like that. And so definitely I have a lot of respect for the Dead and Mickey Hart and the kind of over the larger sort of San Francisco and West Coast culture that they were a part of. I started to learn hand percussion and Middle Eastern percussion here in the Bay Area, and there were a lot of great teachers, like a really incredible drummers, both local and from the Middle East, that I got to take some personal lessons with. And there's this thing called what is it called? I haven't been there in years, but it's Middle Eastern music and dance camp in Mendocino. And it's sort of this camp out thing where all these teachers and students go out in the woods and learn stuff, and there's belly dance there. So that was a good learning experience. And other things. So I definitely benefited from the kind of influx of different kinds of music and culture that comes into the Bay Area. I'm also sort of like the way I started out playing drums on drum set was sort of in the Northwest, though. I'm sort of a grunger in a lot of ways. The way I started out was playing in these sort of post-punk grungy rock bands when I was in college in Portland. So, and that's a whole side of the musical culture of the West Coast that I don't have any real direct contact with so much anymore. I don't play drum set anymore, but still it definitely was a big part of where I'm coming from. That's how I learned to play drums at first, playing in rock bands. And
right on.
So I have great respect for that culture too, the Seattle, music and all the Northwest rock music. It's, definitely part of it's a little more distant background for me, but it's still there in a lot of ways.
I was going to say, could you hear my coffee pot gurgling in the background?
No.
Okay.
No.
Okay. I realized I never turned it off, and it was rumbling away, and I've heard it a few times. I'm like, damn it, I should have turned that off. It's interesting because I definitely feel like there is a different energy from place to place, and there are certain sounds that come out of certain areas, which is, I guess, why I was kind of wondering about what your thoughts and feelings were on that. I know there's been different people that I mean, when I say people, I have talked to different friends who have different theories about the Vancouver area. And I've heard from different people saying that, Vancouver, we don't have a huge music scene here. Considering it's a fairly large city, we don't really have a lot. It's fairly small. And I've also heard different people say that Vancouver, is a very cold city. I don't know what your experience of that is, but I've talked to different people that have come through and said that, it's a very sleepy city. The energy is very low and different things like that. And then, I've also heard people go as far as to say that they believe that, Vancouver is cursed land because it was sacred. It was sacred territory for the First Nations, and most of it basically is unceded territory. And so a lot of people think that the energy and the juju is really bad out here. So I've often wondered about that. Have you noticed, though, when you're playing, I imagine you would get quite fine-tuned with the energy of a place and the crowd or the festival when you go and play from place to place. Have you noticed sort of a difference of, like, maybe you've gone back to the same place and it's the same kind of, vibe or whatever, and then you go to another place and it's maybe more lively and vibrant, and that's just the energy there? I'm very curious about whether or not you've had that experience.
Oh yes, I definitely have found that the vibes of places are different, and there's some places that I clicked with a lot earlier than others. I mean, eventually, I hope to go all over the country, and there's great people wherever you go. But I have to say, the Northwest and in particular Vancouver were were some of the first places I traveled to play gigs. You mentioned Beats Without Borders, and I got to give them credit. Like that, playing with Beats Without Borders was one of the first gigs I ever traveled out of town for in 2013. So yeah, I got to give the shout out to Niels and that whole crew. They're great. I've had a great time playing in Victoria and Salt Spring Island. Those were two also like very early places where I played as baby Drumspyder so many years ago. And I find that I have really clicked with the vibes generally in the Northwest. One of my favorite places to play is the Seattle, Washington area, and like the Imagine Festival on Orcas Island is probably my favorite festival overall.
I'm gonna write that down.
And it is interesting though if you want to look at it in a more fine-tuned way, talking about the different energies of specific cities. It's an interesting topic. My subjective impressions of Vancouver as opposed to, say, Victoria or Salt Springs, and I find then like in Victoria, whenever I play there, it's just been totally on. I just feel this really good energy there. Often I've played at the Sunset Room there, which is a great venue. Vancouver has also been receptive, but maybe a little bit tougher, like a little bit of a tougher crowd, harder to get at the Beats Without Borders shows. It's been a little bit harder to get a good turnout there. My impression was that it's like maybe in Vancouver, the vibe's a little more like dubstep heavy and people wanting a little heavier bass sound than what I do. Whereas like Victoria is a little more like kind of ecstatic dancey vibes, and people just want to get into the rhythms and the beats and dance and stuff. So that's been my impression so far. This has been great. Great people and great audiences everywhere, but I find maybe in some, I think in the bigger cities, you often find this as a producer, like people are a little bit into the heavier sounds and, wanting this kind of like a little more of a hardcore dubstep thing or something like that, or sort of hardcore like glitch hop, like out in Denver. And so, it's, it always, it varies a lot by place. I'm sort of used to being a kind of oddball in the electronic scene. Like I don't do a distinct genre of electronic music. Like I'm not really aligned with dubstep or trap or any of the electronic dance genres. Sort of do my own mix of things, and I play at a great variety of tempos. So I'm kind of used to the thing where, people might really dig one part of my set, and then I speed up the tempo and it gets a little too fast for them and they kind of drop off the dance floor, and then I slow it down and they come back. And so, it's,
do you watch you watch all of that from up there? I don't know how like in the zone people are when they're on the stage, but like noticing that kind of stuff.
Oh yeah, and most gigs I definitely notice. Some stages are bigger, and so you're farther away from the people, and so you don't quite see so much what's going. But a lot of times I play in pretty small rooms, and so you're up close, and you can you can feel the vibes of what people are into, and so it's so you do have that kind of feedback, and as far as sort of the crowds, like reading the crowd and the crowd's feedback, my position is a little bit different from a DJ, whereas like a DJ often will improvise their set and they have a great variety of music they'll put on. They'll sort of like work with the people dancing and sort of read the energy. Like I only play my own tracks, and so I pretty much come into it with a planned out set, and I don't really improv the track order to. So I just sort of go in there and just like, I'm going to play what I'm going to play.
Yeah, take
so
it
like
or leave it.
what I'm doing is a little more like a band. You just go in and play your set, and if people hate it, then well, too bad. So, but people, most of the time people don't hate it, but it's yeah, but I'm used to just sort of taking things in stride. Like, like some people are going to like some tracks more than others. You're going to click with some crowds more than others. I just kind of roll with it,
Fair enough.
Yeah.
Well, I was thinking, I was thinking a lot about music and, why I, as a listener, am drawn to certain sounds and certain kinds of music. Obviously, like I've named you and, a few others for obviously my preference of music. And then I was thinking, okay, well, what is music? Music is a frequency, and it's literally energy. It's a frequency, and then I kind of started thinking, depending on what a person is listening to, it can completely change the way you feel. Like it evokes a different feeling inside of you. Like obviously, if you're listening to something like Wardruna, and then you're listening to some, folk or anything, like it all changes the way you feel, or like major versus minor and all those kinds of different subtleties. And, I was wondering how important for you in the creation process, your intention and mood behind when you're creating something. Like, maybe you've created something and you're having an off day or you're in a sour mood. Did that change what came out of you and into the music?
Yeah. Usually my pieces of music are built over a pretty long time, or talking about the scale of at least 2 weeks to do a track, and probably more like 3 or 4 weeks, like from the very beginnings of a track where I'm just learning the melody and then building up all the different parts. So with every track, I think often it's not quite like the specific mood of a moment, but it's more like this general feeling that I built up through a lot of different layers.
Right.
In my current music, the kernel of it, the seed where a track starts from, is always some kind of traditional melody from folk or medieval music. And so it starts with learning that on the instrument. And then I try to just like dig into that tune and see like how I feel about that tune and what that brings up for me. And from there, I add the other layers, like the other melodic parts, the harmonies, the bass line, the beat, everything based on like what that tune brings up. But I try to make it all centered on that original melody. And so I'm kind of like adding my layers, which are sort of my interpretation of that tune or my take on that tune. And I find that one of the reasons I love working with the traditional music, like the folk music, is that they're so rich in associations, and each tune brings up a lot of feelings for me, just kind of vibing on it as a melody. But then they also have interesting histories and stories behind them often, and they come from specific places. And I love engaging with the history and the stories behind the music and things like that. I love engaging with history in general. I feel like I'm one of those people. I'm always in some kind of dialogue with the past and with with earlier eras. And
right.
so
when you're creating your music, do you, I know you had kind of mentioned, like the forest and the bonfire and the bare feet and, people dancing. Do you often, when you're creating music, have develop a story of what you're seeing in your own mind to your tracks?
Well, yes, it's often, it's not so much a specific story or a concept. I mean, I do songs mostly without lyrics. They're instrumental, so it's a little more like abstract. But I definitely, oh, sorry.
Nope, go ahead.
I definitely have I definitely have like a picture in mind. Like I have a sort of picture of the kind of celebration or the kind of ritual or occasion that this would be used for. Like on the most recent album, there's a version of the English folk song John Barleycorn, and that's about the harvest and kind of the cycle of the year, like the food coming from like the seeds and the grain and growing into the harvest. And I picture some kind of harvest celebration, some kind of like autumnal revelry going on to that. And there's a bit of a dark side to it. There's kind of like, the harvest and the autumn season is about like the death and as well as bringing in the riches of the harvest. And so like all those things kind of go into the feeling that I try to put into the song.
Right. Well, yeah, I don't obviously know a lot about the creation process of music, but I know that for me as a listener, sometimes I hear something and I can see in my mind's eye like a set and a setting, and you can feel that vibe, you can feel that energy of what you're listening to. And I think that that kind of, it all translates for us on the other side listening to what you're creating. So I definitely am getting, that's why I was curious about what kind of stuff you're seeing and feeling when you're creating this, because I'm receiving that similar setting and feeling from your music when I listen to it. So it's coming across.
All right. Good to hear. Yeah.
So, I know we've been talking for a while and getting into some different, lots of different things actually. But what I was really curious to know was how for you has music been a spiritual journey? Because I imagine that it has been, if you would be able to share some words on that.
Well, I think there's two main aspects of that come to mind now. Is that at first, drumming, when I first started playing drums, it was the first like intensely physical thing like that I've ever done. In a way, it was like I wasn't athletic. I didn't play sports and anything, and it was, I think, so part of what drew me to drums at first was just like the intense physical aspect of playing it, and then the kind of the things we were talking about earlier, the kind of craft discipline, the meditative discipline of practicing the drums and getting your rhythm really precise and building up patterns and building up techniques slowly, and that was really like of one piece with my early experiences with meditation and yoga. Like I started all of that about the same time. So it's like, so it's sort of engaging with drumming as this kind of physical and meditative craft. But at that time, my music was not really connected in a specific way to my spiritual path. And then gradually over the years, when I evolved, when I was doing musically, it they sort of came together more and more. And so now I kind of feel that my artwork, music, and spiritual practice being more integrated than it ever has been, because my music is sort of connecting with the pagan traditions, and my artwork is too. So it's all kind of, coming together in an exciting way in the past few years. But very early on, I was interested in the other aspects of drumming that as a kind of trance-inducing technique. In one of my early dance groups in San Francisco, we actually did these sort of all-night dreaming rituals where people would get together at a house and do like lucid dreaming. And so for some of those, I played this kind of style of trance drumming all night.
Cool. We gotta come back to that. I want to know more about that.
Yeah, it was a great experience. And yeah, the whole dance troupe as a group would go in and do these group meditations and dream rituals. And so that's when I got into that as a kind of trance drummer. And that was without any real, like, I never studied with a shaman or anything. It was just sort of like this, I just kind of worked in my drumming in this kind of, I don't know, this way. And it was really, just worked it out how to do it, like on the spot. And but it was a great experience.
Intuitive.
And since then I've been, I've drummed for rituals of various sorts. Now I sometimes participate in rituals with a local pagan group and play drums. I even played flute once.
Nice.
So, yeah, there's been a lot of interesting, like, intersections here and there. Like, I'm not really part of a pagan group. I'm kind of solitary with heathenism at this point, but I've intersected a lot with kind of rituals of various sorts, and it's been a really interesting experience.
So do you find, because you strike me as somebody who, obviously you're very creative, but you strike me as somebody who probably, your mind is always working. Am I correct in saying that? Your mind's like, yeah, exactly. So when you're talking about, I'm like that too. Like my mind, I'm always thinking about something, whether it's past, future, or sometimes it's like fantasizing, I'm in Middle Earth, whatever. I find that my mind is always going. So to be really in the moment with something, it's like when your mind is now kind of, it's in cessation, it's stopped. You're kind of completely present and in the moment. So I was kind of thinking that maybe when you're talking about trance and drumming and like being in that, is that sort of when you feel like free from your mind and completely present in the moment because you're so immersed into it? Because you said it was so physical for you. And what was it kind of like that?
I definitely appreciate the way that drumming can like absorb you and put you into a trance, and I think probably that's one of the reasons I was attracted to drumming at first. I mean, I started playing drums when I was a philosophy student, and like my life was very intellectual. At the time, as it always has been, in various ways, but it was, I love that part of it, how it was immersive. It brings you out of the thoughts, and it's a very grounding thing. Like a lot of, sometimes the drum as an instrument is associated with the element of earth in the four elements of earth, air, fire, and water. And so drum tribal. Is the earth instrument. And I really feel that. And I like that sort of earth, because I'm actually a little more of an airy intellectual type. And
me too. I'm bouncing all over the place here.
It's very complimentary. But then one of the reasons I took up the flutes, the Celtic whistles, is that it's the air instrument. It's sort of like the opposite of the drum in a way. It complements the drum. It's kind of like the wind, the voice.
Yeah, so then you're kind of bringing in more than the earth, you're bringing in the air elements. I know, I wonder about the fire. What would the fire element be?
Some associate stringed instruments with fire.
Interesting.
And I don't know if there's a clear like water instrument. In my sort of personal way of thinking about this, I associate strings with fire. I kind of think of that like plucked string, that kind of, like the energy that a good like rhythm guitar can have, or think of like flamenco guitar, something fiery, and that kind of something about the plucked string kind of thing often just sort of like brings up the energy of music. And my personal association with water is I always think of like bass sounds, and the kind of liquid bass sounds is something that makes it more, or maybe the atmospheric sounds in the music, something that makes it a little more fluid and flowing.
When you're saying that, I'm like, you're talking about water sounds. I'm thinking a tipper.
Yeah. A lot of people describe certain bass styles as being sort of like liquid bass or swamp bass or things like that. But I think they're getting at that aspect of it, which is sort of electronic music can be very fluid and very sort of morphing, like one sound morphing into another. It's in a way sort of the electronic medium you can think of as sort of like it has the capability to melt sounds all together and turn one thing into another.
So what you were saying, philosophy, what kind of philosophy were you taking in university?
I was I had a great interest in philosophy of mind and philosophy of language and cognitive science. Like, I went to grad school at UC San Diego and concentrated on sort of philosophy of cognitive and neuroscience and things like that. Cool. I didn't get too deep into I'm not like a scientific person really at all, and so like I didn't get too deep into like neuroscience itself, but things in that realm. I also I loved like German philosophy and sort of history of philosophy generally. I think what's really stuck with me is not so much the specific and technical topics that I studied. I mean, those are kind of long forgotten in many ways, but what I really value is the study of history and the traditional thoughts, like the Western traditions. I love studying ancient philosophy of the pre-Socratics and Plato and Aristotle and such. And so that's kind of like the aspect of it which stuck with me more than anything, is that sense of the history, the traditions. Like the philosophy is always somewhat related to spiritual practice and religion and art, and so it's kind of, to me, it's all kind of one thing. Like the roots of the tradition are very deep, and I like to study like the different aspects of like religious thought and philosophical thought as they relate to the art and music. It's all kind of one thing. Sort of merges into one thing in my mind, really.
And then how did you go from that? And then you were saying all of a sudden, you're playing at trance, lucid dreaming, drumming. Like, I want to hear more about that as well. Like, how did that sort of, how did you kind of get introduced to that scene?
Oh, that was the first dance troupe I got involved with when I came to San Francisco. And it was mainly formed by people who had come up from Southern California, and they just happened to be in this kind of into ideas of shamanism and lucid dreaming and kind of spiritual practice. It's kind of like came from a lot of different influences. It was a bit of maybe an amorphous and somewhat chaotic kind of combination of ideas. It wasn't like an orthodox thing of like one school of shamanism or anything like that. But it was it's somehow like that group of people came together who were like-minded and wanting to explore consciousness and explore the dream state. So it just kind of, it's one of the things that we did.
What did that look like? Because you were saying, like, would everybody like go to sleep and then try to like lucid dream and find each other? Like, how did that? What did that
they
look
had
like?
a system where it was kind of like a slumber party. Everyone's like sleeping over
Cool.
on the floor of a house, but there'd be these scheduled times, like every hour, like everyone would wake up and try to like write down their dreams or sort of regain consciousness of their dreams, and then go back to sleep. And then a certain people would be kind of meditating, sort of keeping watch over things. And for a lot of those ceremonies, like I would just like play this kind of quiet trance drumming through much of the night.
Nice. Would anybody take any like plant medicine or anything like that? Or because I know that's that would definitely help.
I didn't myself. I've never been really on the kind of psychedelic thing. It's just not really my path. That was just when I was younger, and I could stay up all night.
I know I can't. I can barely stay up past midnight now.
Yeah. In those days, I would just drink a bunch of coffee.
Yeah, I know. I've been drinking coffee the entire time we've been talking here. Like, that's one thing. I'm not huge into booze. Like, it's sort of like a once a year kind of thing for me, but a good coffee. But I will participate in ceremony if there's a really good ceremony. I was lucky this over this past year to be introduced to a few First Nations ceremonies, and I did it was with the Native American Church. It was a teepee ceremony, and that was with peyote, and it was very intense, very interesting, very intense. Just not so much the peyote, but the just the sitting, because sitting for me, since my last car accident that I had, is very challenging. So that was very, very challenging for me. But what I found was when you are put into those kinds of situations, it really tests, like just to stay up all night. Holy smokes, that is a test of will.
Yeah.
Big time. So yeah, it has to be the right occasion. But yeah, I'm definitely not one of these, people call them psychonauts or whatever, where they're, people that really, really enjoy psychedelics and plant medicine and all of that. I'm not really somebody who enjoys, I enjoy I feel like I need to be in control. I don't like the feeling of being out of control. And so for me, it's if there's an intention and a purpose behind a ceremony, I will definitely explore and try something once or whatever. But yeah, I mostly just prefer my coffee.
Yeah.
It's a good way to be.
I think that nowadays I still drum for myself, like kind of solitary rituals and observances in the heathen tradition. But it definitely it is not taking the form of very extended trance sessions. Like I think I've come to like more clarity of just what my own path is about and what my role is, and like I don't see my own path as being shamanistic, and it's just not the kind of trance journey to other worlds kind of thing, like, and it's just not what's called to me. And but I still love to do, incorporate drums into my own personal rituals, and it gets trancey sometimes, but just on a smaller scale, and it's not all night for sure.
There's so many ways, like, and this is kind of something I've been talking about with different guests on my podcast. There's so many different ways that you can reach that state inside of yourself. And that's the beauty of all the different rituals and practices is that you can find your own way and you can explore that. And I think that that's what life is really about, is, exploring what that looks like for you. And I'm not a huge fan of when people get into this is the right way and this is the way and stuff like that, because I'm very much of like, I pick and pull things from lots of different cultures and traditions, and that's a good way to develop your own faith without having to follow maybe a set of rules that somebody else put into place. I'm also not a follower of rules. I'm not a fan.
Yeah.
I like to pave my own way.
Yeah.
So then have you got some ritual happening for the full moon that's coming up here?
Yeah, I will be observing in some way.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, before I know, because we've been chatting for a while here, and I'm realizing I didn't plug my computer in, and I'm hoping I don't have to run over then plug it in. Rookie mistake on my part. I was just going to ask you, when you do your personal rituals, what is it? Am I allowed to ask what that kind of looks like for you? I know you said drumming, obviously, but.
Oh, sure. Well, the basic form of heathen oscillatory rituals is the bloat, and it means making an offering to the gods or ancestral spirits.
Mm-hmm.
Usually that's in the form of some kind of drink, like mead is usually the sacred drink, although it could be cider or wine or something else. And so that's like the kernel of it, is just that gesture of devotion of making an offering.
Mm-hmm.
And so usually for me, it centers around that. And there are certain prayers and kind of devotional meditations where you reflect upon the deities of the ancestors, and you also just like appreciate what they represent and the kind of qualities that you want to bring into your life associated with those deities. They're kind of like a channel for bringing, like, in which you sort of pay respect to certain qualities and ideas and kind of spiritual currents.
I like that.
All over the place here, but that's the basis of it. Like the basic ceremony of making the offering is pretty simple, but for me, it always tends to expand into something a little more like a drumming meditation. Like I have certain rhythms that I play for certain deities and for certain runes, which are Northern European symbols. And so I have my own kind of like rhythmic code that I've been developing of drumming patterns and drumming styles that I play. And so it ends up being a kind of a sort of meditation with the drum for the most part, in which, I do the kind of the ceremony part of it, but then the real essence of it is that sort of tuning in with the drum and, seeing what I get from that, or like seeing where that takes me.
I like what you said about the different gods having different qualities and strengths that you pull in from them. I really like that. And that's actually somewhat similar to what one of my Vaishnav friends, they said to me that, because I'm like, why is there so many gods in Hinduism? And they were like, well, because there's so many different aspects of God. And then as an individual, it's in what way you relate based on your life and your experiences to that aspect of creation. It's all the same. It's all one and the same, but it's just different aspects. So I was thinking of that when you said that, and I really like that. Some people think that if they meditate and pray on, say, like Kali, like she's like the fierce, she's like the fierce aspect of like the feminine god or whatever. And so people think if you and if I'm butchering this, I'm not an expert in any religion, but anyhow, they say that, yeah, if you pray, you're going to get those fierce qualities of like strength and like warrior almost sort of. So I like that. Oh, well, I absolutely have enjoyed this conversation. I know we've jumped all over the place. I had all these footnotes prepared. And then we got into so many other interesting things. So your air quality and my air quality, we traveled.
Yeah. Well,
it's been fun,
I've really enjoyed this as well. I mean, if you have any questions that you really want to ask, and go ahead.
Okay.
If you want to wrap up, that's
yeah. No. I'm totally enjoying the conversation. Let me just we can keep going here a little bit. Let me just grab my plug here. I don't want to I don't want this to die while we're chatting. So just let me go grab it. All right, there we go. Yeah, I was talking to my partner, and I was just saying, like I don't want to ask people the same questions, I don't want to ask generic sort of, I wanted to ask questions that we could take in other directions, because when you ask something that maybe someone hasn't been, asked before, it gives you so many options to talk about other things. And I really, with doing my podcast, I genuinely enjoy talking to people of different walks of life, and just sort of really discovering how a person got to where they are. And there's so many like little things that you miss if you don't take journey off on these different tangents. You miss a lot. And I also wanted to try to ask you questions that you didn't already, that you're not generically asked. So I had actually listened to some other interviews that you've done with other people and did some reading. And I was like, I'm not going to go in there and be like, I don't want to ask you, are you from like Europe and the British Islands? Because you're very inspired by those places. Because I already knew that you weren't from those places. So I'm like, okay, I got to ask some really far out different questions that can give us the opportunity to discover some other things along the way. So, yeah, I just wanted to say thank you for taking this huge long journey with me, this way, that way, another way.
Yeah. Yeah, well, thank you. It's been really interesting. And I don't do that many interviews either, so it's always kind of interesting new experience to talk to someone like this. So,
yeah, and it's fun. It's good when you can do the face-to-face. Like obviously, when you can do like an in-person podcast, obviously it's a lot better. But what I've been realizing is a lot of the people, like I want to talk to interesting people from a lot of different walks of life. I don't want to just, I've had a lot of yoga people on, but I don't want my podcast to just be yoga people. Like I like talking to different kinds of people. Obviously it's all fairly spiritually themed, but, I realize that I'm going to have to do Zoom calls for my podcast in order to be able to reach all the different folk that I want to talk to. So yeah, actually, I do have a question for you before, we go off on another tangent. I'm sure we can take this a little bit further here. Were like when you were growing up and you grew up in Massachusetts, I feel like, did I say that right? I feel like I never say Massachusetts.
Oh, Massachusetts?
I said Massachusetts. I do that every time someone corrected me on that a little while back. And I was like, okay, I'm just going to Massachusetts.
It's hard to spell. I don't know if I could spell it correctly myself.
So in growing up, were you into music as like a child? Like what were you like as a kid?
Oh yes. I My grandmother on my mother's side played piano. Other than that, it wasn't not quite growing up in a musical family, but my parents were very encouraging and they had a great record collection and they let me listen to things. And they say that the first piece of music I was ever obsessed by as a small child was Tchaikovsky's Nutcracker. And I still love it.
Oh, I just went to see that for Christmas with the family, the
Yeah,
play.
it's a masterpiece for sure.
It
It's
is.
beautiful. I still love
yeah.
it. And then they also had classical music and 60s records, the Beatles and things like that in their collection. And then when I started buying my own records as a teenager, I got into this sort of like prog rock kind of things like King Crimson and Yes and other. It's mainly kind of centered on like 60s 70s bands like Led Zeppelin was also early inspiration for drumming. Like Bonham's still one of my favorite rock drummers. So then I got musically curious and into all kinds of stuff. Like later when I was a teenager and I was in college, it seems strange now, but I listened to like the weirdest, most experimental, bizarre noise when when I was like in high school. I got into like John Cage and Stockhausen and Iannis Xenakis, all these kind of music that was made out of like noises with tape spliced together, things like that, like industrial,
Okay.
like throbbing gristle and that kind of thing. So like all over the place. I mean, I used to listen to music that's so much weirder than I do now, and in a strange way, like that's been sort of my journey. Is that like early on, I just sort of went way out into this kind of avant-garde, experimental kind of headspace, and ever since then, I've been on a journey towards, I think, getting more grounded and appreciating the traditions and getting more connected to my ancestral traditions and traditional music. And
what is your ancestry?
Yeah, so that's been an interesting part of the journey, kind of going from the very modern back to the traditional and very organic kinds of music, and also just playing more real acoustic instruments and things like that. And I think the drums, like being involved with the drums, sort of it was an integral part of that process, because drumming is so primal. It's so much like your hands are just on this drum head and it's just hitting something. It's just like one of the most primal, basic musical activities. And so it sort of, it had an effect on me. Like I love, in some ways, I respect all the elaborate intellectual constructions of music, of modern music and classical music and stuff. But for me, it's like the core of it is always that primal activity, that physical engaging with the instrument. Whether you're hitting a drum or blowing into a flute, it's just, I just kind of, I love the sense of being connected with something very ancient, like things like these. I mean, musical activities of playing drums and flutes were things that people were doing probably 10,000 years ago or more. I like that.
What's your ancestry?
Part of my family, my father's side of the family, is mostly English, British Islands, like English and Scottish. And my mother's side of the family is German and German-speaking Swiss. So it's kind of half and half between mainly British Islands and continental European.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
Just a little bit of Irish and Scandinavian mixed in there too, but mainly, basically Northwestern Europe.
Okay. Have you traveled over that way? And seen, have you done some traveling over there?
Yes, a long time ago, I studied for a bit in St. Andrews in Scotland, and then I spent some time in London and the south of England, and I studied also for a bit in Germany and Cologne.
Oh,
so I had a good year abroad of going to various places in Europe.
How old were you when you were abroad?
That was a very long time ago. I think I was like 20 or so on.
Can I ask,
Many
how old are you
centuries
now?
ago.
Yeah, how old are you now? Can I ask? Is that rude? You don't have to say. That's okay. You don't have to say. I know it's like one of those questions some people don't want to be asked,
I
but
think I'll let the chronology remain vague.
sounds
cloudy.
good.
It was back there in the midst of time.
That's okay. But traveling at 20 is like such a good time to travel. Like you said you were there for about a year.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really good age to be traveling. And I know that was my first trip at 20 was to Thailand. And I mean, that's definitely a little bit of a different, Southeast Asia is a different vibe than traveling to Europe. But I feel like kids should take the time to go abroad and travel as a part of their education, because you learn so much about yourself and the world, and to step outside your comfort zone and your bubble. It's a really good age to travel.
Yeah. In a strange way at the time, like I didn't know how much of an influence these early experiences would have on me. Like when I went to Scotland, it was a little bit of a random thing. Like I just wanted to have some year abroad new experience, and kind of like, oh, Scotland, that looks cool. This program's available at St. Andrews. And now, like years later, I'm doing all the Scottish music, and I just, I look back to that experience as very formative, like the kind of things that I saw, like the historical sites. St. Andrews is a great old medieval town. I saw a lot of like ruined castles and churches and things. And
now,
I'm
what is
also in London spent a lot of time at the British Museum, and they've got medieval artifacts there and old manuscripts and things like that. So
what does it feel like being in places like that? I know we're talking about energy of different places. Like, what does it feel like being in a place that's so old and rich in its ancient energy?
Oh, well, like I feel like I felt a great connection to the place and to the roots. I mean, I think before I knew that I was going to be like a pagan or a musician doing this kind of tribal fusion music, and in a way, I think that I in certain places in England, like I think I sort of got an intimation of the idea for it. Like I definitely recall being in Glastonbury, just sort of visiting all the usual sites of the Glastonbury tour and the Chalice Well and things like that. And just walking down the street there, I remember having this idea that like, what I wanted to do is form some kind of pagan tribal band or something or other that would be like, pagan traditions and drumming and sort of like neo-tribal. So it was just this vague little dream, it's not like a definite idea, but in a way I think even back then I sort of had this kind of very unformed, vague idea of what I'm doing now. In a way, it's sort of kind of like percussion based, somewhat tribal music.
It was kind of like the beginning of walking your path a little bit.
Yeah.
So as I'm like thinking of these places, this is how whimsical and airy I am. I was thinking of fairies. Okay, you have to tell me. Do you believe in fairies?
Yes.
Okay. Because I had this conversation a few years back where I was like, okay, anything is possible. So fairies must also be possible. And it's a part of me that obviously I really just want to believe in fairies, but there is so much about that in the folklore over there. So I wanted to ask, like,
yes, I believe that there's spirits of the land and all the natural phenomena. Like every culture really has this in the tradition, is like where they're not only like the great gods and deities, but they're also like the local spirits, the local entities that that infuse the place. And I think that's what we're talking about when we say like a place has a certain vibe or a certain atmosphere or spirit to it. And I know that this is a great part of like the practice of the old pagans and heathens was based around these very local things. They weren't always just worshiping Thor and Zeus and the great gods, but the records of the time show that a great part of what the folk practice was, worshiping at springs or sacred trees or certain sacred groves. And like when you look back in the Anglo-Saxon records, and that's sort of what the early Christian church in England was trying to stamp out. It was like these priests, the Christian priests were complaining very late into the Middle Ages that the people were still worshiping trees and worshiping springs and streams and whatnot. And it's because the priests were complaining about that. That means that that's what the people were doing. And even late into the Middle Ages, when England and other European countries had officially converted to Christianity, this connection with local spirits and this belief in things like fairies and elves and dwarves was still very much alive.
Yeah, actually, I was kind of briefly talking about this yesterday with a friend, and I mean, she's living in Cambodia right now, but she's from here, and we were just kind of talking about the importance of rituals and ceremony and how a lot of those traditions feel quite like they've been lost. And I mean, I think that I think what I mean by like a lot of those traditions being lost, I mean for someone from Canada, European background, I feel really disconnected from my roots. Like I don't really feel like I have much in the way of those traditional sort of roots. I mean, I'm Ukrainian and Polish and English as well. So I'm sure, of course, if I start tracing back, there's definitely roots there, but I don't feel connected to anything. And, we were kind of talking about how important it is for people to have rites of passage and ritual, because not only does it give you a connection to the earth, the land, the creator, also to one another. And some cultures still hold on to those traditions, but for people with like European background, a lot of us are like, we're kind of disconnected from that. And then I was posing the theory of how hard certain religions tried to eradicate that, and how many witch burnings there were, and like even just like an attack on paganism as well. I know that there was a huge attack. And so it's kind of interesting now where we are, so many of us feeling disconnected, we want to go and connect and have these sort of ritual gatherings and just trying to find something where we can feel like that sense of connection and belonging. But I really do think that there's just been a very, very long journey of trying to eradicate those things in the name of, certain religions I won't name. But I think that that's probably had a huge influence on why there's less of that for the average person these days. It's been
Yeah. Like, well, religious conversions were a big break in European culture. And it's, it's complex. I mean, there's a lot of things about the Christian religion and Christian culture, like the music and the cathedrals and beautiful things that I really respect. But it was a great break in our traditions. And that's a whole difficult topic in itself. But I think the general thing that I'd like to say about sort of recovering that connection, like connection to ancestry and connection to the land and stuff, is that it's like learning a craft or any other art. It's like what we started talking about. It's kind of like one step at a time. It can't be done in a day. It can't be done in one like ceremony, or you just have this great revelation. It's piece by piece, just learning about where you come from, like learning that you do have an ancestral tradition, you do have a culture, and just kind of, just learning something about that all the time. I encourage everyone to look into their ancestry and kind of where their family comes from, and just to look into cultural traditions. I think a lot of this current culture is really focused on newness and just like the next thing. But I've made it like a lifelong study of traditions and old music and art, and I think everyone should have a piece of that in their life, have a piece of like something that grounds them and like connects them to the past and connects them to traditions.
Well, that's important as well, because they've been proving more and more now with science that we have ancestral trauma. So, something that, let's say, I forget what it was, a study that they did, and it was, I guess this is like through epigenetics or something that they've been proving this. And I'm definitely not super skilled in and well versed in this, so my knowledge is limited, so bear with me. But what they had said was that basically a trauma experienced by, say, 4 or 5 generations before, even longer than that. So say you had a family member that had to hide in, a confined space or something like that through some kind of war or Holocaust or something like that, then that fear of confined spaces, like claustrophobia, could then be passed down to let's say a grandchild or a great-great-great-grandchild that's never been exposed to anything like that. So there's certain phobias and fears and anxieties that they've been proving that you may have, and it has nothing to do with anything you've experienced in this life that could have been perceived as trauma, but it actually is in your blood. It goes back to ancestors and relatives. And so I know I kind of always, thought about, okay, my family is from Ukraine and Poland, like a lot of my family. And I don't really know a lot about that side of my family because they pioneered to Canada, years and years back. They were some of the first Ukrainian pioneers to Canada, to Alberta. And other than that, I don't really know anything. But I had a friend point out to me about how many women in particular were executed in the Ukraine for basically being witches, lots of witch burnings and things like that. And it's interesting because my sister and I, our whole entire life, we've been very drawn to magical type spiritual things, like using Ouija boards when we were young. And my sister had a spell book for a while, and just so, we've always been really drawn to that. And I never really made that connection till I had a friend, start asking me about that. And then just different things that I've picked up on and heard over the years. And, I've questioned, I can't prove any of it, but I've really questioned how much of who I am today is related to where I come from. And so to have such a huge disconnect, but I don't know where to begin. I mean, I guess that's a crappy excuse, but.
Yeah. Well, it's a huge topic, and I feel that in a lot of ways, I'm just sort of beginning to connect to the ancestral traditions. It's but yeah, like in my family, we have some knowledge going back. I'm not like brushed up on like the details of the family tree right now, but I know that we have records of my father's side of the family was in the United States very early on in New England, like since the 1600s. And my mother's side of the family goes back to Germany and Switzerland. And I've been to a few of the ancestral places like Lucerne, Switzerland. And
hey, they make good cheese.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a beautiful place. It's a kind of a lake town, and there's this beautiful like Renaissance era bridge with all these sort of painted murals on it. It's a remarkable place, like mountains all around it. I was feeling the vibes there too, for sure.
I bet.
Yeah, Lucerne. Yeah, I mean, I think that yeah, like you can't run away from history. I guess it's and I think engaging and kind of affirming your ancestral traditions are the way of healing those things. And it's not simple. It's not always like, oh, my ancestors were great and we were the best, or we were horrible. It's all, history is always complicated, and there's a lot of different sides to it. And so I think the best way to heal it is to be aware of it, be aware of the history.
I know that is actually something that I've thought about that's always kind of blown my mind. Like, you don't really, I mean, obviously we don't really spend a lot of time thinking about this, but if you think back to like family members and bloodline, like there's always going to be so much like trauma. Like, I was thinking about that. I'm like, somewhere along the line, I had family members that must have been like murderers. And then I've had family members that have probably also been murdered. Like, I know that's a dark place to think about, but it's the way that life is. That's the way that human nature, it is the dark side of human nature. And I think back to that, and I'm just like, how much of that goes back in my history, we'll never really know. But that's somewhere my mind takes me when I think back to, like, what kind of stuff happened with my ancestors, and what did they have to go through? What did they survive? How did they survive? Were some of them evil?
Yeah, perhaps. Yeah. Well, one of the things that first attracted me to paganism and heathenism as a path is that in the polytheistic ways, there is a great acknowledgement of the dark side of life and the shadow side. And like you were mentioning, the goddess Kali, and there are similar, Hel is a goddess, Hel, is a goddess in the northern tradition who rules over death and the underworld. And so I always find that I sort of need that in my life, like a spiritual path that really acknowledges that shadow side and the underworld dark side, and not everything's going to be like white light and happy and everything. And so I think there's a real wisdom in that, and in the sort of the variety of the gods and spirits in the polytheistic systems. And like, life is complicated.
Yeah.
Like, we need a path which fully acknowledges that, which fully owns that. Yes, yes, there is good and bad in all of our ancestry. We do come out of these chaotic tribal roots, and conflicts and wars and things happen. And it's something it's good to, like, a lot of the music that I study, has this sort of like the folk songs often are very dark and tragic, and they deal with tragic events and stories. There's a good book, like offhand, there's a good book I can recommend about English and Scottish folk music, and the title of it is Mad Love, Murder, and Mayhem.
Wow.
Yeah.
I'm gonna write that down.
It's about the child ballads, which are it's a classic collection of English and Scottish folk ballads, and it gives the lyrics and the histories and the interpretations behind them. It's
See,
a good book.
Because that's the thing, like human nature is complicated. It is not all rainbows and butterflies. And, that's kind of something I started discovering along this journey, the last couple of years of just trying to heal my body is, having these good days, having these bad days, having these really dark times, these dark moments. And, and then I'm getting on my Instagram, and it actually started out with me just selling yoga apparel. And I realized that it wasn't meaningful, and I didn't want to do that anymore. I wanted to do something like I have to do something that has meaning behind it. And so I'm like, okay, I started getting into the writing aspect of it. But I was going on there, and I'm seeing so many people that are just talking about all this, like, power of positivity and, thinking positive. And it was so fluffy, and I couldn't relate to it. I'm like, no, like I can't, like, yes, I think that we have so much power to change our circumstances. We do shape our reality. It is all these little steps that accumulate to catapult our life in the right direction. But life sucks sometimes and things happen and no one is immune to it. And so that's what I started focusing more of my writing on, was this sort of, what do we all have in common? Okay, we all suffer. That is what is human. That's what makes us human. And when you acknowledge that, we all have this dark place inside of ourselves, it's okay, because it exists in everyone. And then it's just not getting stuck in those places. And when you can transform the suffering and the pain, and you come out like the other side with all these lessons and things that you've gained from it, there's something beautiful about the darkness. There's something beautiful about pain. And that's why I'm actually quite drawn to a lot of minor chords and things like that. These sort of sad, beautiful, haunting kind of sounds. Like, I love that, because I think that it's just a very, very human thing to experience. Not just the light, fluffy stuff. I think life sucks sometimes.
Yeah, well, that's been a great part of music and art for me as well. Is like the dark music, that kind of dark gothic looking art and things that it's really a work of alchemy. For me, it's really a work of transformation. You can take some of those darker emotions and painful experiences and work them into a piece of music or work them into a piece of art. It's one of the greatest, I think it's one of the greatest kind of like transformative processes that we have available to us. And I'm sure that people can experience that in other practices like yoga or meditation if they're real about it and they acknowledge, they face what they're facing and not try to avoid it. But yeah, it's hard to explain. It's like I don't have this sort of master theory of like the alchemy of art or anything, but I sense just in my bones that that's what it's about. It's like that's part of the reason people create music and art, the transformation of these experiences.
Well, like you said about facing it, that is something that I was just talking about in my last episode. With my yoga teacher, and he's saying when it's the suppression of these emotions that causes imbalance and pain and like physical manifestations of some really unpleasant things, not only in our body but in our life, and it's in the facing that stuff, really facing it, that you can transform it. So it's interesting, talking about and relating it with music, but I'm seeing so many different things I can also relate that to. And I think that people often avoid the ugly stuff and nobody wants to look at themselves and be like, wow, I am a control freak. It's like probably really overbearing and annoying for my partner that I tend to when I'm stressed out, I micromanage. You know what I mean? Like, that is a really crappy thing to have to acknowledge in yourself. But if you don't realize it and you're unconscious of it, you can never, ever do anything to change it. And so, even looking at like the darker aspects of yourself, maybe childhood, everyone goes through something. You have to face those things and, not dwell on them, but like you said, you transform them in some way. And yeah, it is a wild ride being a human being.
Yeah. Yeah. I think also like part of the alchemy and part of the process, like when you have a project or you have a goal that you're working on and you want to achieve some kind of results, it is a great engine for getting to know yourself. And part of my musical journey and my progress towards just being, kind of like on the loose or being, just a drummer in bands, not really accomplishing that much in early life. And sort of my progress towards, getting tracks out, getting music out, getting gigs and forming a career as a musician, is that I've really gotten to know myself a lot better than I did like previously. That process of being engaged in this project of music has really gotten to know things about myself. So kind of like I know, like, oh, here's the part where I tend to like overthink these things and never get anything done. And so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to schedule certain work times and schedule practice times. And like, I've really gotten to know a lot about like how I work best and what my own personal process is. And it's been pretty illuminating journey. And I think I've definitely come out the better. I've learned a lot about just sort of like my own process and my own kind of like what do you call them, just sort of like pitfalls or I don't know, this kind of blind alleys you can go down.
Well, Scott, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me today and talk about all sorts of different things. It's been an absolute pleasure. I've really enjoyed chatting with you, and we got to figure out some festival or show, something like that we can get jumping out this way. Because I feel there's maybe it's just me, but I'm sure it isn't. I feel like there's a huge call for your kind of music and what you bring to the scene. So we should talk a little bit more about something like that.
Well, thank you. Yeah, this has been a great conversation for me, and I'd love to come up that way and and play. And and I'm very I'm very enthusiastic about like sort of new types of events starting up. I play at a lot of like tiny festivals that are just starting out, and I know it can be a very tough business to start up new events and new kinds of things, but
lots of learning.
I always love to be involved, and people are kind of exploring like different kinds of events and how we can come together.
Yeah, I mean, I'd absolutely love that. And you can come out this way and, we can get together. You can meet Bronson. And I'm sure you guys would have a lot to chat about, especially with some of the pagan, the path that you guys are on for sure. And it's been great. Thank you so much. And let's keep in touch.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Take it easy.
All right. You too.
Thanks again for tuning in to another episode of the Shanti Ma podcast. Without you, there would be no podcast. It would literally be me just talking into a mic all by myself, which I guess talking to myself is not so out from the usual. But anyhow, thank you so much for supporting the show. If you're interested in sponsoring the Shanti Ma podcast, please feel free to hit me up on Instagram or by email with a DM. And today, just to end things a little different, we're going to play some Drumspyder music. I love Drumspyder, and I know you will too. Enjoy. Until next time, bye.